So when Emil sent me this concept for the talk, one word that stood out for me was the term ethical, which I think is interesting and really tricky to define, particularly when it comes to contemporary art. So I sort of just wanted to start with a couple of questions. Is it ethical putting photos of children in advertising cabinets without their parents' explicit permission? Is providing free Wi-Fi to young people to essentially download anything they want unethical? Is talking to strangers in the library and going to their home, asking them to dress me and photograph me whilst taking their knowledge and distributing it to the art world without payment unethical? How about inviting singles to present elements from their dating profiles in a public art space? So I've done all of those things, and I think it's really important to keep questioning, you know, the power relationships you have when you work with people that might not consider themselves artists. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that there's no sort of pure way to go about developing a work with someone that's new to you, and that without risk, art becomes quite sort of easily digestible, and I guess I feel like there's a little bit of a difference between socially engaged art and perhaps community practice or community cultural development. And I think, you know, to make an artwork which interrogates a place and or a concept or a community is different to perhaps working with a community and sharing skills and then sort of handing over authorship and allowing that community to sort of create their own artwork. So my work is often with people who don't consider themselves artists but don't necessarily consider themselves part of a community, and sort of placing what they do in their ordinary lives on a contemporary art platform. So with that in mind, sometimes long-term involvement is great, and sometimes it's unnecessary and perhaps intrusive to encourage a long-term collaboration with someone. So I thought I'd just show you some of my past works to kind of get a sense of the different people I've managed to collaborate with and how their sort of input has affected the outcomes of these projects. For me, I think sometimes the process of making a work is as significant as the artistic outcome, and sometimes I try and put that process on display in a public way so that people can see it, and maybe they think it's an artwork or maybe they don't, but it doesn't really bother me. So a few years ago I made a project called the Experts Project, and it was interesting because in the sort of description of tonight it said the non-expert, and I think I was trying with this project to reconsider what expertise is. And for me, expertise was sort of like a skill or knowledge that I didn't have myself. And so to me, these people that I met were experts in these very particular things. And I met them mostly in public libraries. And I ended up meeting 100 people who would share their knowledge with me or their skills, and we'd have a chat, and then we'd end up going back to their house and they'd dress me as them and take a photo of me as them to kind of signify this exchange. So this one was how to make decorative toilet roll holders with a woman called Cheryl, who you can see in the mirror. This one was teen magic. You can see all the little bits and bobs on the bed there. This was dark art that was in Campbelltown in New South Wales. How to treat diabetes naturally. So yeah, there was a series of those lessons that I kind of built up for myself, and then took those photos and then shared them in kind of a durational performance lecture So sometimes those people would come to those lectures and like continue the conversation around what they knew, and sometimes they would be absent and not keep engaging with me or with the work, which, you know, is another way people work. But we ended up making a little book and putting those books back into the libraries. This was the one I mentioned about single people, and we put, with an artist called Amy Spears, we put a ad in Craigslist, I think, to invite singles to basically put elements of their dating profile into an artistic space, and that's a platform gallery. And that was another sort of chatting process, and then in their homes going through some of their things and borrowing them and putting them in these cabinets, which is where like thousands of people kind of go to get on the train each day. So in a sense, this was like a very kind of public display of loneliness and desire, and it was really great meeting quite a cross range of single people that were up for expanding their online dating profiles into real life. This is the Melbourne Art Fair at the exhibition building, and strangely enough, this quite commercial organisation wanted to commission a whole lot of socially engaged art one year. And I worked with an artist called Jason Mailing, and we looked at what happened in the exhibition building other times of the year when the art fair wasn't on. And most of the time it's got a whole lot of expos in it. I don't know if any of you've been to them, but there's a dog expo, a psychic expo, house reno expo. So Jason and I ended up attending most of these expos on Saturday mornings, and they were really amazing. They were just sort of, you know, some were more commercial than others, but mostly they were like quite intense hobbyists who were just gathering together and finding, you know, another kind of community. And mostly they were lots of people that would come nationally together to present and sell the one thing. So for the art fair, we invited store holders from these different individual expos to set up at the Melbourne Art Fair and sell their shit. So maybe that was a tattoo, or maybe it was a very expensive French gold clock. And we hung out with them for like 4 days straight and didn't ask them to perform, but some people did think that they were acting because they were quite charismatic and interesting characters that we invited along. This is the Astroscan 2000. It's been operating since 1979, and it prints out your fortune. That's from the Psychic Expo. Whole lot of cosplay artists from the kind of comic book expo. They, that Dalek was sort of on high rotation around the whole art fair, kind of slightly irritating gallerists. So yeah, in terms of that project, I think that felt quite interesting, almost like we were presenting these people as exhibits in themselves. And yeah, we sort of made sure in conversations with them that we acknowledged that it was a really strange place for them to try and sell their wares, but also like we paid them and made sort of this engagement, you know, really clear and felt like it really suited their sort of quirky personalities. So it ended up that, you know, the tattoo guy really bonded with the antiques guy. So it was quite fascinating to witness. Felt like I was just semi-removed. I work a lot with a group called Field Theory, and we make a lot of work that is site responsive, and this is a big stadium in Christchurch, New Zealand that was affected from the earthquakes and has been closed because of damage. And we managed to negotiate access to this site and live on it for 3 days, and did a non-stop radio broadcast about the site, which was particularly strange for me because I have like absolutely no knowledge of sport and very little knowledge of New Zealand. But I think that was part of the challenge, and part of the performativity of the work was getting to really ask the people of Christchurch to tell us what happened there and what should happen with it. And this was quite a fun project. We had very little sleep and got to meet quite a number of Bon Jovi fans. And we're doing something similar, just a little plug, at the Queen Victoria Markets in a few weeks for Melbourne Festival. So if you are a Melbourne market type and would like to come on and tell us a event that you'd like to remember, please do. We'll be there 6 days straight, sleeping, eating, only market food, wearing only market clothes. This is a really cool woman called Shirl, who's 87, and she has a show called Joy's World on community television in Sydney. And she is amazing, has kind of had this very DIY career, and films all of her television shows from her garage. And she has 30 or more years of archives of the show. It's just kind of like a really entertaining talk show of interviews with the local community. That's the television studio. She's got a lot of hidden cables throughout, and editing technology and so forth. So yeah, I got to meet Joy when I was researching the end of analogue television as it moved into a digital broadcast, and immediately thought she was the expert of the field. And we made a work together where we were part of a kind of festival in an art space, and did a kind of live video feed of her interviewing local artists and sort of engaging in contemporary art world. And we mixed that with a whole lot of edible static. So we made something that looked like edible static that people would consume, and it would disappear because, as you probably know, static doesn't exist anymore with digital television. So I can show you a little video here. Spaghetti. So this was at the Malt House, and worked with a whole lot of different people, high school bands, Italian women's choirs, puppeteers, to basically in great detail reveal the story of Australia's #1 song of all time, so biggest selling hit of all time, by a guy called Joe Dolce, called Shut Up Your Face. And the work sort of progressed with members from the audience sort of one by one coming down onto the stage and entering into this restaurant, and that was kind of littered with performing plants who would also come down and do their thing to, I guess, showcase very strange facts from this song's history and from the history of this very unique character called Joe, who's also a poet, an activist, a chef, and a real prankster. So the final person left in the seating bank of the theatre was Joe himself, and he came down at the very end of this kind of pretty silly spectacle and just asked if there was any questions. So the kind of theatricality sort of turned into community forum talking about the song and how it's been both celebrated and I guess hated, and its kind of relationship to multiculturalism, and the fact that it was used as a method of torture by US psychological troops. This is a pizza thrower, and because the song was used in a lot of pizza throwing championships. It was on The Simpsons. It's, it is a real Australian cultural artefact, and we kind of wanted to celebrate that, but also kind of interrogate it and think, and sort of celebrate this eccentric artist, Joe Dolce.
Are there any questions?
It was called A Singular Phenomenon, which is from a quote that Joe said, where he's a guy from the Skyhooks said something kind of derogatory about the song, and Joe said, well, my song's a phenomenon. I'd rather have a phenomenon than 7 piddly hits. So, yeah, he followed up Shut Up Your Face with a song called Reggae Matilda, which didn't go so well. And we had a character in the show called Reggae Matilda that kept trying to get on stage and kept getting taken off. So I encourage you to seek out that song. It's quite an interesting one. How are we going for time? This is a project called Ultimate Vision Monuments to Us, where I was invited to make an artwork at a Hurstville Westfield shopping centre. And it was quite a bizarre project to respond to. It was firstly inspired by girls fighting on the rooftop, and the money was coming partly from Westfield, who actually didn't really want an artwork in their shopping centre. But they did want the council to approve their extra car park, so they worked with them to give them some money towards this project. So I would describe this project as long-term and a bit of a battle, but it went... I mean, Emile mentioned the new shop thing, so like one of my first ever artworks was a very brash anti-consumerist artwork. So the fact that they chose me to do a project that was funded by Westfield was pretty ridiculous. But we ended up doing a whole lot of interruptions, so they weren't interventions into the shopping centre, with local teenagers, and there was a lot of kind of troubles trying to interrupt the shopping centre, so I wanted to use their sound system, but their sound system is controlled by a head office in Queensland. So essentially all the Westfields are playing the same music at the same time. We did manage to change most of the clocks in the shopping centre, and to play a lot of our films on the display televisions and in their cinema, and insert some things into their advertising cabinets. This is not something I could have achieved as an independent artist. It was a curator from the Museum of Contemporary Art called Anne Loxley who really twisted everyone's arms, and I'm eternally grateful for her amazing power in that regard. But it was, it was sort of this long-term project where I set up a hub in the middle of the centre court in the shopping mall and spoke to young people about what their kind of favourite things were. And then when all those votes got added up, we turned them into interruptions in the shopping centre, or I called them monuments. So there were tours of the monuments, and a whole lot of businesses changed their shop fronts to the teenagers' chosen colour, which was blue. Surprisingly, the best drink was water. Everyone was expecting it to be bubble tea, but it was a very healthy choice. Thomas Kim is a local guy that everyone voted for as the best person, so they all dressed up as him, and we inserted these into the food court tables, and it was quite weird watching people eat on top of these teenagers. And so I ended up working with a guy called Kevin Jin, that's him there, the tall guy, and he is a bit of a amazing young person who is also a bit of a punk, and he loved spending time at the shopping centre because the rooftop had a really great view. And we talked a lot about what teenagers do when they're not shopping, and then we made a film about that and played it in the cinema and on the television screens around there. And Kevin was just like a naturally quirky and artistic character. So I ended up a year later inviting him to do a presentation at the MCA about rat's tails, because he has had a rat's tail for most of his life and is a big supporter of ratties. So he did that's him there. He did a quite hilarious performance lecture on the history of the rat's tail at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And yeah, that's him there, and that's him post-talk. And then I got invited by the MCA to make a course for teenagers, an online course about the art that I like and my practice. And so I invited Kevin back, even though he's now in uni, and we made a whole lot of videos about, I guess, socially engaged art, but 1 week was on edible art, the next week was on site-specific art and power. One was on people, and one was on, I forget, but it's called Hello Big Institution, and if you know anyone in high school, they can sign up for the course. But this, I don't know if it's too hard to read, but this is my favourite kind of task that the students did, which was kind of develop really quirky dishes for a menu for the MCA cafe, and all the dishes that they kind of designed sort of reflected political or social issues that they cared about. So that was kind of hilarious and inspiring. Hopefully one day we'll just have a banquet. So the last work here is called Jakarta Whiplash 93 Revisited, and it's with an artist called Wok the Rock from Yogyakarta in Indonesia. And I did a little residency in Jogja and met Wok, who's a really amazing artist, and asked him to collaborate with me looking at the popularity of Metallica in Indonesia and a very specific event, which is a 93 concert where there was a big riot, and Metallica sort of played the concert in front of cars on fire and shopping malls on fire. So I wanted to sort of understand that event a little more, and got to meet a whole lot of metalheads, and all these guys were at the concert, and part of it was that the concert was very expensive and it was in a newly gentrified area. This was kind of pre the fall of Suharto, so people kind of think of this riot as the beginning of a very politically rich time. And I also met with a whole lot of young people that weren't at the riot to understand it from their perspective and sort of understand the politics of Metallica as well, who I'm pretty sure are very conservative. But there's like 33,000 Metallica fans just on Facebook in Indonesia. So there's a really rich community there. They go on camps, like the fans go on these like regional camps and do all these activities together. Like it's really interesting community. This is a fax that Metallica sent, kind of us trying to separate themselves from the riot because there was an unbelievable amount of damage, and it ended up that heavy metal was banned in Java for the following 10 years. And so the interesting thing for me coming to it a couple of years ago was you might know that the president of Indonesia is a metalhead, Joko, and he was partly responsible for heavy metal coming back and people being able to tour again. And he attended a Metallica concert 5 years ago, or maybe slightly more, after the laws were lifted, and his name was chanted by this like 60,000 strong Metallica fan base, and then he got elected. So I think Metallica are partly responsible for the current president of Indonesia. That's him there in the crowd of Metallica fans. And this is a expert in metal music who's doing his PhD on metalhead communities in Indonesia. So that was an exciting person to meet. We ended up asking a Metallica cover band in Sydney to play the set list from the riot show, and Wok kind of introduced each song in kind of a politically historical way, and that was at Gallery 4A a year or so ago. And speaking of that, I have merch for you, which is we designed a whole lot of Metallica merch that could double up as potentially being used in a riot. So here's some lighters, and I don't want to promote smoking, so maybe you have a fireplace or a friend that you can pass it on to. And very quickly, the last sort of socially engaged project I worked on was in a funeral home, and I got a job with Dark Mofo for a couple of months, and literally on my first day was staring into a warm crematorium. So they invited me to put on an event in this quite amazing looking funeral parlour in Hobart, and I got to meet the funeral director, Scott Turnbull, who was a really fascinating and incredible person to get to know. And we talked a lot about the death industry and kind of the taboo subject of death and how we kind of ignore it until it's too late, and ended up being quite a sort of debaucherous party in his place, with a whole lot of kind of site-specific performance works responding to this place. And next week I get to start working with him again on a new project. So that's where I'm at, and thank you very much.